Blueprints are supposed to be the absolute truth. They are promises made of ink and paper. They tell you exactly how much weight a beam can hold, how deep a foundation goes, and exactly where the walls are supposed to be. My father was a master architect. He spent his entire life designing spaces that made sense. Spaces that were open, transparent, and logical. But the blueprint he left for his own house was a lie. My name is Arthur. Like my father, I draft floor plans for a living. I trust numbers. I trust geometry. If a space exists in the physical world, it must exist on the paper. 2 weeks ago, my father passed away quietly in his sleep. We hadn't spoken much in the last 10 years. He had become a recluse, retiring early to live alone in a large, aging Victorian house at the end of a dead-end street. The house was surrounded by overgrown oak trees, casting long, heavy shadows over the roof. Next door to him was an empty, boarded-up property that had been abandoned since the late 90s. When the lawyers handed me the keys, my only plan was to clean the place out, renovate the outdated kitchen, and put it on the market. I just wanted to be done with it. I arrived at the house on a quiet Tuesday morning. The air inside was stale, smelling faintly of old pipe tobacco and dry rot. Dust motes danced in the pale light filtering through the dirty windows. I went straight to his ground floor study to look for the property deed. His mahogany desk was impeccably neat, but leaning against the bookshelf was a heavy leather drafting tube. I popped the cap off. Inside was a single roll of thick, yellowed vellum paper. I spread it out over the desk, weighing the corners down with a brass paperweight and a cold cup of coffee. It was the original architectural floor plan for the house, drawn by his own hand in 1998. The lines were precise, the measurements noted in his familiar, sharp handwriting. I decided to take some quick measurements of the second floor, just to see how much square footage I had to work with for the real estate listing. I grabbed my laser tape measure from my tool belt and walked up the creaky wooden stairs. The second floor was simple. A long hallway, a guest bathroom, my old childhood bedroom on the left, and my father's master suite on the right, which shared a wall with his private upstairs library. I stood in the library first. I placed the laser measure against the plaster wall and pointed it at the opposite side. Beep, 14 feet across. Exactly what the blueprint said. Then I walked next door into his master bedroom. I measured the width. Beep, 16 feet across. Again, perfectly matching the paper. I was about to put the tool away, but the structural engineer in me, the part of my brain that automatically calculates spatial relationships, felt a sudden, uncomfortable itch. I walked out into the hallway. I measured the total length of the exterior wall from the outside edge of the bedroom to the outside edge of the library. Beep, 38 feet. I froze. I looked at the digital display. Then I looked back at the doors. 14 feet for the library. 16 feet for the bedroom. If you add a standard 6-inch thickness for the interior wall dividing them, the total footprint should be exactly 30 feet and 6 inches. But the hallway exterior wall was 38 feet long. I stood there in the silent, dusty corridor. My heart started a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. I did the math again in my head. 38 minus 30.5. 7.5 feet. There was a gap of 7.5 feet. Right in the middle of the house. Between the master bedroom and the library. I walked back into the library and pressed my hand against the shared wall. It felt solid. It looked like normal drywall, painted a dull matte gray. There was a large oak bookshelf pushed up against it, filled with heavy encyclopedias. I went into the master bedroom and looked at the other side of that same wall. Nothing. Just a blank space where a large antique mirror was hanging. There was no door, no air vent, no seam in the baseboards. According to my father's blueprint, the two rooms shared a single, continuous wall. But numbers don't lie. Physical space doesn't just disappear. I walked slowly back downstairs to the study. I leaned over the desk, staring intently at the yellowed vellum paper. I traced my finger along the ink lines of the second floor. The drawing was flawless. It showed the library and the bedroom sitting flush against each other. But if you looked very, very closely, under the harsh glare of the desk lamp, you could see it. The faint, ghostly indentation of an eraser mark. He had drawn something there. And then, he had meticulously erased it, redrawing the wall to hide the gap. My father hadn't just made a drafting error. He had intentionally manipulated the blueprint. He had sealed off a space measuring 7 feet wide by 20 feet deep. And he had lived in this house, sleeping right next to that hidden void. For over 2 decades, the house was completely silent. Outside, the sky was turning a bruised, stormy gray. And the first few drops of rain began to tap against the glass. I walked out to my truck. I didn't grab packing boxes. I didn't grab cleaning supplies. I opened my heavy tool chest, and I pulled out a 20-ounce steel claw hammer. I was going to find out what my father built in the dark. I was going to open the wall. The first swing of the hammer echoed through the empty house like a gunshot. It was a harsh, violent sound, shattering the quiet afternoon and the steady rhythm of the rain outside. I had chosen the wall in the master bedroom. I carefully lifted the heavy antique mirror off its brass hooks and set it gently on the mattress. Behind it, the wallpaper was a slightly brighter shade of beige, untouched by years of sunlight. I ran my hand flat across the surface. I knocked with my knuckles. Thud, thud, thud. Solid wood stud. I moved my hand 4 inches to the right and knocked again. Hollow. I gripped the rubber handle of the steel claw hammer. I took a breath, and I swung. The heavy steel head punched right through the drywall. A cloud of white gypsum dust immediately puffed out into the room, smelling of dry earth and old construction. I pulled the hammer back and swung again. And again, methodically breaking apart the physical barrier my father had built. I didn't rush. I used the claw end to rip away large, jagged chunks of the plasterboard, exposing the wooden framework underneath. Once I had cleared a space between two studs wide enough to fit my shoulders, I stopped. I wiped the sweat from my forehead. The air pouring out of the hole was freezing cold. It didn't smell like a dead, sealed-off space. It smelled distinct. It smelled like ozone, machine oil, and old celluloid. I pulled my phone from my pocket and turned on the flashlight. I stepped up to the jagged edge of the drywall and aimed the beam into the dark. I expected to see bare insulation. I expected to see forgotten plumbing pipes or electrical conduits. But the beam of light cut through the floating dust and illuminated a finished floor. Dark polished oak boards. My heart was doing a slow, heavy drumbeat in my chest. I carefully stepped over the wooden base plate and squeezed myself through the narrow opening between the studs. I was standing inside the blueprint's lie. The space was exactly as my math had predicted. 7.5 feet wide, 20 feet long. It felt like a narrow, claustrophobic corridor, running parallel to the bedroom. I swept my flashlight around the room. The walls were painted a dark, flat gray, designed to absorb light. There were no windows, no air conditioning vents, just total, suffocating darkness. But the room wasn't empty. At the far end of the narrow space, pushed up against the exterior wall of the house, was a single, worn leather armchair. The leather was cracked and indented, shaped by years of someone sitting in the exact same position. My father's position. Beside the chair was a small, heavy metal table, and sitting on top of the table was a machine. I walked slowly down the hidden corridor, my boots leaving soft footprints in the thin layer of dust. I reached the table and pointed my light at the heavy metal object. It was a vintage 16 film projector, an expensive, professional-grade model from the late 1970s. The metal spools were empty, but the machine was plugged into a heavy-duty extension cord that snaked along the baseboard and disappeared into a small hole drilled through the floor. He had run independent power down to the basement, just to keep this room off the main electrical grid. I looked at the front of the projector. The heavy glass lens was pointed directly at the wall in front of it. I stepped closer and traced the path of the lens. Right at eye level, when sitting in the leather chair, there was a modification in the wall. A small, perfect rectangle had been cut out of the drywall, no bigger than a paperback book. I leaned in and peered through the hole. My father hadn't just cut through the drywall. He had carefully removed a single brick from the exterior masonry of the house, and in its place, he had installed a thick piece of glass. I wiped a layer of dust off the glass with my thumb. I looked through. The rain was coming down harder now, streaking across the hidden window. Through the glass, I had a perfectly framed, unobstructed view of the property next door. The abandoned, boarded-up Victorian house that had sat empty since I was a child. But the view wasn't aimed at the front door. It wasn't aimed at the street. The tiny window was angled slightly downward, pointing directly at the basement windows of the empty house across the property line. A cold shiver ran down the back of my neck. My father, a respected architect, a quiet, solitary man, had built a secret room in the center of his home. He had furnished it with a single chair, and he had spent God knows how many hours sitting in the pitch black, staring at the rotting basement of an abandoned house. Why? What was he watching? Or who was he watching? I turned my flashlight away from the hidden window and looked back at the metal table, tucked neatly underneath the lower shelf, were 3 heavy, galvanized steel lockboxes, the kind used to transport hazardous materials or sensitive film. I knelt down on the hardwood floor. The dust clung to the knees of my jeans. The first box wasn't locked. The metal latch was cold to the touch. I popped it open. Inside, lined up in perfect chronological order, were dozens of round metal film canisters. Each one had a piece of white masking tape stuck to the lid. And on every piece of tape was my father's precise, architectural handwriting. I picked up the first canister in the row. The metal was freezing in my palm. I read the date written in faded black ink. October 14th, 1998. The exact year he drew the altered blueprint. I put it down and picked up the last canister in the box. November 3rd, 2015. 17 years. He had been filming something in that house for 17 years. The rain drummed against the roof above me. A steady, hypnotic sound. I looked at the empty spools on the 16 projector. I knew what I had to do. I needed to see what my father saw. I opened the first canister. The smell of old film, vinegar and nostalgia, spilled out into the cold room. I lifted the reel, carefully threading the delicate celluloid strip through the mechanical metal teeth of the projector. Over the rollers, past the lens, and onto the take-up spool. I found a small switch on the side of the machine. My hand hovered over it for a second. I was an engineer. I liked things that made sense. I liked foundations that were solid. But the foundation of my family was about to crumble. I pressed the switch. The projector hummed to life. A low mechanical purr that vibrated through the floorboards. The bulb ignited, casting a brilliant, blinding beam of white light through the dust-filled air. The light hit the wall right next to the hidden window. And then, the numbers started counting down. 5, 4, 3, 2. I sank down into my father's cracked leather chair. I stared at the blank wall, and I waited for the ghosts to appear. The film flickered, a frantic dance of dust and light against the dark gray wall. Click and click and click. The sound of the projector was steady, hypnotic, like a mechanical heartbeat in the silence of the hidden room. At first, there was no image, just the grainy, sepia-tone texture of old 16 celluloid. Then the sprockets caught, and the frame stabilized. The view was shaky, captured through a long-distance lens. It was the basement window of the house next door. The house I thought had been abandoned since I was a child. But in the film, the boards were gone. A soft, warm light glowed from behind the glass. I watched breathless as a shadow moved across the frame. A woman. She looked young, her hair tied back in a loose bun. She was carrying a tray of food. She sat down at a small table, her back to the camera, and began to read a book by the light of a single lamp. I leaned forward, my face inches from the projected light. "Who are you?" I whispered. The film jumped to a different date. December 1998. Snow was piled high against the basement window. Inside, the same woman was decorating a tiny Christmas tree. My father's camera zoomed in. He wasn't just filming her. He was documenting her. Every movement, every tilt of her head, captured with a chilling, architectural precision. I felt a wave of confusion. My father, the man I respected, was a watcher, a man who built a secret room just to stare at a neighbor who didn't know he existed. But then the film changed. The woman stood up and walked toward the window. She didn't look scared. She didn't look like someone being hunted. She stopped at the glass, placed her hand flat against it, and she smiled. She wasn't smiling at the yard. She was smiling directly at the lens. She knew he was there. I stood up, my shadow stretching long and distorted across the wall. I needed to see more. I grabbed the next canister. July 2002. The woman was older now. The basement looked different, more comfortable, filled with books and a small upright piano. She was playing. I couldn't hear the music, only the mechanical whir of the projector. But I could see the grace in her fingers. Then a second figure entered the frame. A tall man in a dark suit. He walked with a slight, familiar limp. He approached the woman and placed a hand on her shoulder. She leaned her head back against him, closing her eyes. The man turned toward the camera. The blood drained from my face. The man in the film was my father, but he looked younger, happier. He wasn't the cold, distant architect I remembered. He was laughing. He leaned down and kissed the woman's forehead, then looked straight into the camera and gave a small, playful salute. My brain felt like it was short-circuiting. If my father was in the film, who was filming? And if my father was in that house with that woman, why did he build a secret room in our house to watch her? I ripped the reel off and grabbed the last canister. November 3rd, 2015, the final recording. The image was digital now, transferred back onto film. The quality was sharp. The basement was gone, replaced by a clinical white room. A hospital bed sat in the center. The woman was there, but she was skeletal. Her skin was like translucent parchment. My father sat beside her. He looked the way I remembered him, old, gray, and broken. He was holding her hand, staring at her with a look of such agonizing love that it made my chest ache. She reached out a trembling hand and touched his cheek. Her lips moved. I read them clearly. "It's time, Thomas, let me go." My father shook his head, tears streaming down his face. He leaned in and whispered something into her ear. Then he stood up, walked to the camera, and reached out his hand. The screen went black. I sat in the silence of the hidden room. The rain was a dull roar against the roof. My mother died in a car accident in 1998. That's what the death certificate said. A closed casket. I was 3 years old. I looked at the blueprint on the desk downstairs. The gap wasn't just a room. It was a bridge. I remembered the extension cord snaking through the floor. I grabbed my flashlight and ran. I didn't go to the bedroom. I went to the basement of my father's house. I pushed aside the heavy laundry machines. I tore away the insulation behind the furnace. There, hidden behind a false electrical panel, was a door. A heavy, steel-reinforced door. It led to a concrete tunnel, lined with white tiles, stretching out underneath the property line, stretching toward the abandoned house next door. My father hadn't been a stalker. He had been a protector. I stepped into the tunnel, the air turning cold and damp. I was walking underneath the earth, following a path that had been hidden for 28 years. At the end of the tunnel was a ladder. I climbed. I pushed open a wooden hatch and emerged into a room, smelling of lavender and old paper. The basement of the house next door. It was exactly as it was in the films. The piano, the shelves of books, but it was empty now. I walked to the piano. On the music stand was a single sheet of architectural vellum. It wasn't a house. It was a drawing of a garden, filled with lilies and oak trees, and in the center, a small headstone. I looked at the name engraved on the drawing. Maya. I turned around and saw the window, the one my father had watched through for 17 years. From this side, it wasn't a window. It was a mirror. She could never see him, but she knew he was there. I realized then why the blueprint was a lie. My father didn't just build a house. He built a sanctuary for a woman the world thought was dead. A woman who couldn't leave, because the people she was hiding from were still out there. And then I saw it. On the floor next to the piano. A small leather drafting tube. I opened it. Inside was a final blueprint. It was a map of the city. And marked with a bright red X was the cemetery where my mother was supposed to be buried. But there was a note in my father's sharp, precise hand. Arthur, if you are reading this, the wall is open. The truth is heavy, but it is yours now. Go to the oak tree. Look for the root that grows deep. I stood in the center of the secret house, realizing that my life wasn't built on a foundation of stone. It was built on a foundation of ghosts. And the biggest secret was still buried in the rain. The rain didn't stop. It felt heavier now, soaking through my jacket as I stood in the middle of the old cemetery. The iron gates had been left unlocked, swinging slowly in the wind with a mournful, rhythmic creak. I followed the map. The red X led me far away from the manicured lawns, past the rows of neat marble headstones, to the very back of the property where the old woods began. And there it was, the great oak. Its branches reached out like twisted fingers against the stormy sky. This was the place where my mother's headstone stood, the one I had visited every year on her birthday. Maya Sterling, 1970-1998. But I wasn't looking at the stone anymore. I was looking at the ground. I knelt by the thickest root, the one that grew deep into the earth, just as my father had written. The soil was soft from the rain. I didn't need a shovel. I used my hands, digging through the wet mulch and cold mud. My fingers hit something hard. Not a stone, not a coffin. It was a heavy, industrial plastic casing, bolted shut to keep the moisture out. I pulled it from the earth and wiped away the grime. Inside was a small, waterproof pelican case and a set of rusted brass keys. I opened the case. There were no more films. There were no more blueprints. Instead, there was a thick stack of legal documents and a small digital voice recorder. I sat back against the rough bark of the oak tree. The rain blurred my vision, but I pressed play. The recording was scratchy, filled with the sound of a hospital monitor beeping in the background. Then I heard his voice. Not the cold, distant father I knew, but a man whose soul was being torn apart. Arthur, he whispered, if you are hearing this, then you have found the room. You have seen the films, and you are wondering why I turned our life into a fortress of lies. He took a shaky breath. The sound of a cough echoed through the tiny speaker. In 1998, your mother didn't die in a car accident. That was the story the agency gave me. The story I had to tell the world, and you. Maya wasn't just an architect's wife. She was a whistleblower. She had found a flaw in a government contract, a structural shortcut in a federal building that would have cost thousands of lives. But the people behind it, they didn't want the truth to come out. The wind howled through the oak branches above me. I gripped the recorder tighter. The accident was an attempt on her life. I found her before they did. I knew that as long as Maya Sterling was alive, she was a target. So I made a deal. With the help of a few people I trusted, I designed a death, a closed casket, a tragic fire, and I built the bridge. My father's voice broke. The beeping of the monitor seemed to grow louder in the recording. For 28 years, she lived in that basement. She lived in the shadows of the house next door. A house I bought under a dead man's name. I built the tunnel so I could be with her. I built the secret room so I could watch over her when I couldn't be there. I sacrificed my life, and I sacrificed my relationship with you, just to keep her breathing. I looked down at the headstone, the name Maya Sterling. It wasn't a grave. It was a decoy, a hollow shell of granite meant to satisfy the men who wanted her gone. The documents in this case, they are the proof, my father continued. The original contracts, the photos of the faulty steel, the names of the men who tried to kill her. I couldn't release them while she was still here. I couldn't risk it. But she is gone now, Arthur. She passed away in my arms 3 days ago. Finally free of the basement. Finally free of the dark. The recording fell silent for a long moment. I could hear the sound of him crying. A soft, broken sob that made the hair on my arms stand up. I am an architect, Arthur. I spent my life building structures to protect people from the elements. But the most important structure I ever built was the one that kept your mother safe. Even if it meant you had to grow up hating me. I hope one day you can look at the blueprints again and see the love in the lines I drew. The recording clicked off. I stood up slowly, my legs cramped and cold. The rain had slowed to a drizzle. I looked at the documents in the case. The truth was heavy. It was a burden I never asked for. But as I walked back toward my father's house, I didn't feel like a victim of his lies anymore. I looked at the old Victorian house, with its secret room and its hidden tunnel. It wasn't a house of ghosts. It was a monument. I walked up the creaky stairs to the master bedroom. I stood before the hole I had hammered into the wall. I didn't feel the need to close it. I walked into the hidden room. I sat in his cracked leather chair. I reached out and touched the 16 projector. It was still warm from the last time I ran the film. I looked through the tiny glass window at the house next door. It was dark, it was empty. But for the first time in my life, the space between us didn't feel like a lie. It felt like home. The sun rose the next morning. But it didn't feel like a normal Tuesday. The air was scrubbed clean by the storm, smelling of wet earth and pine needles. The shadows in the house felt lighter, as if the walls themselves had finally exhaled a secret they had held for nearly 30 years. I stood in the center of my father's study. The final documents from the Pelican case spread out before me. The names, The dates, the cold corporate greed that had forced my mother into a living grave. Most of the men on that list were long gone, retired or passed away. The threat had faded with time, but the weight of it remained. I didn't call the police. I didn't call the newspapers. Instead, I called a courier. I sent a copy of every document to a retired federal judge, a man my father had mentioned in his notes as the only one who never stopped asking. The truth was out of my hands now. It was finally in the light. Then I went back upstairs. I stood in the master bedroom, staring at the jagged hole in the drywall. I had my tools laid out. Screws, new plasterboard, a bucket of joint compound. I was supposed to fix it. I was supposed to hide the gap, to make the house look logical again for the real estate market. I picked up a piece of fresh drywall and held it against the opening. But as I looked into the narrow, dark corridor, at the chair where my father had sat for 17 years, I couldn't do it. I dropped the board. It hit the floor with a hollow thud. I wasn't going to sell the house. I wasn't going to erase him. I spent the next 3 days working, but not to hide the room. I removed the remaining pieces of the broken wall, widening the opening until it was a proper doorway. I cleaned the oak floorboards in the hidden corridor until they shone. I painted the dark gray walls a soft, warm white. I moved his leather chair into the center of the library, and I replaced the 16 projector with a small lamp. The tiny glass window, the one that looked out at the house next door. I didn't cover it. I polished the glass. Now it was a skylight for a memory. On the last night, I walked down into the basement. I stood before the steel-reinforced door behind the furnace. I touched the cold metal. I thought about the tunnel, the miles of white tile, the silent walk my father had made every single night, just to hold her hand. I didn't lock the door. I didn't seal the tunnel. I just turned off the light. I walked back up to the second floor. I stood in the library, which was no longer a secret. It was just a part of the house. The gap was gone, not because I filled it, but because I accepted it. I sat down in his chair. The rain started again, a soft, gentle drizzle that tapped rhythmically against the roof. It wasn't a storm this time. It was a lullaby. I closed my eyes, and for the first time since I was a child, I didn't feel the need to measure anything. I didn't need to check the foundation. I didn't need to verify the blueprints. I understood now. An architect designs for the eyes, but a father designs for the heart. My father hadn't built a lie. He had built a sanctuary, a space where time stood still, where love was the only structural support that mattered. The house was quiet. The sound of the rain was steady, cool, and peaceful. I drifted off to sleep, right there in the leather chair. knowing that some foundations aren't made of stone. They are made of the things we do for each other. In the dark, when nobody is watching, the secret was gone. The bridge was closed. And finally, everyone was home.